Imagine this. It's the year 1834. You're a royal physician in the Palace of Madrid. The king is dead. Spain has finally fallen silent, at least for now. But your work, it's far from over. You're called not to the public funeral, not to the grand ceremonies of state, but to a locked candlelit chamber deep inside the palace. There, under silk sheets, lies the corpse of Ferdinand VII, the man who ruled Spain for nearly 2 decades, the man who left his people broken, his wives traumatized, and his country teetering on collapse. But you're not here to honor him. You're here to preserve something no historian dares write about in textbooks, something whispered in palace corridors but erased from official records. The final request of the Queen Regent, that you embalm and protect the one part of Ferdinand's body that she claims defined his reign. Not his heart, not his crown, but his grotesquely deformed, oversized genitalia. Yes, really, you freeze at the foot of the bed. Your hands tremble. This isn't a body, it's a symbol of unchecked power, of generational decay, of a monarchy so twisted by pride, delusion, and inbreeding that even its physical legacy defied nature. And as you lift the sheet, you realize you're not just preserving flesh, you're preserving the embodiment of a reign that was itself deformed, bloated, and grotesque in its consequences. Cut to slow montage, ruins of palaces, portraits of weeping queens, maps of a shrinking Spanish empire. Because Ferdinand VII's story isn't just about a king with a bizarre medical condition. It's about how one man's private shame, his deepest insecurity, was allowed to shape the destiny of an entire nation. A nation that suffered for decades, simply because no one could tell a king no. And that raises a deeper question. What happens when absolute power rests in the hands of someone who is deeply unwell? What happens when the ruler of an empire becomes obsessed not with governance, but with his own anatomy? This isn't just salacious history. This is a case study in how personal trauma, left unchecked, can metastasize into national tragedy. Ferdinand's reign wasn't just dysfunctional, it was catastrophic. From royal bedrooms turned into surgical theaters, to political decisions delayed over fertility rituals, to wives dying under the weight of forced intimacy, his story is unlike anything you've ever heard. And yet, few talk about it. Why? Because history has a habit of covering up what makes us uncomfortable. We glorify conquest, romanticize royalty, but shy away from the grotesque, the shameful, the deeply human flaws that often explain so much more. So in this series, we're pulling back the curtain. We're going to explore Ferdinand VII not as a caricature, not as a punchline, but as a tragic warning of monarchy gone mad, of science ignored, of women silenced, and of a man crushed by the weight of his own body and the throne he never should have inherited. If you're the kind of person who believes that real history is messier, darker, and more revealing than what we're taught in school, then you're in the right place. You're not just preserving a king, you're preserving the consequences of silence. Hit that subscribe button, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and get ready, because what comes next is disturbing, revealing, and unforgettable. Before we talk about the Tyrant, before we dive into the trauma, the terror, and the twisted reign of Ferdinand VII, we need to go back to where it all began. Because this isn't just the story of a cruel king. It's the story of a child born into a bloodline already doomed by its own arrogance. October 14th, 1784. A child is born in the royal palace of El Escorial, the spiritual heart of Spain's monarchy. His name? Ferdinand, son of Charles IV and Maria Luisa of Parma, and heir to a kingdom that once ruled half the globe. But Ferdinand's birth wasn't a celebration of new life. It was the latest chapter in a long and dangerous genetic experiment. Because the Habsburgs and Bourbons, two of Europe's most powerful royal houses, had been marrying within the family for centuries, cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, all in the name of pure blood, a misguided belief that royal lineage must remain untainted no matter the cost. And the cost was staggering. Mental instability, physical deformities, infertility, even madness. Historians and geneticists today refer to it plainly, a dynasty built on inbreeding. And Ferdinand was the product of this decay. From the moment he opened his eyes, his fate was written, not by the stars, but by centuries of genetic arrogance. But Ferdinand's condition was unlike any that came before. As a boy, he seemed quiet, withdrawn. But by the time he reached adolescence, court physicians began whispering about something so unusual, so bizarre, that it would never make it into official documents. Only private letters, sealed medical files, and decades of palace gossip would preserve the truth. Ferdinand's sexual anatomy was grotesquely malformed, and not just large, but alien. One physician described it clinically as a member of such unusual shape and size that conjugal union may prove medically hazardous. Another, more blunt. It resembled a billiard cue, narrow at the base, swelling to the size of a man's fist, and so long it could be mistaken for a walking stick. Let that sink in. This wasn't a crude joke. This was a real, medically documented anomaly, one that had a profound effect on Ferdinand's identity, relationships, and eventually, his rule. In an era where male beauty was modeled after the Greek ideal, lean, symmetrical, refined, Ferdinand's body made him feel like a monster. What some today might joke about, Ferdinand lived as a curse. He was mocked behind silk curtains, feared by women in secret conversations. Even his own servants would steal glances and whisper about the prince's shame. Imagine growing up like that, in a palace, with absolute power ahead of you, and yet trapped in a body you despise, knowing your most private self is the subject of ridicule and fear. Every smile feels like mockery, every bow a hidden insult. Ferdinand didn't become cruel overnight. He was shaped by a family legacy that glorified bloodlines over biology, by a court that worshipped appearances but giggled in shadows, by a church that spoke of divine will while ignoring the human suffering that came from centuries of incestuous tradition, and by a body he never asked for. Before he ever sat on a throne, before he signed a single decree or punished a single subject, Ferdinand was already a prisoner, not of a dungeon, but of his own flesh. This was the beginning of his story, and perhaps the beginning of Spain's unraveling. What if your body became your empire's curse? Power doesn't always begin with ambition. Sometimes it begins with pain. Before Ferdinand VII ruled with cruelty and paranoia, before he drove his kingdom to the brink of collapse, he was just a boy, but not the kind of boy you'd ever envy. Because from the moment he could understand the world around him, that world was broken. His father, Charles IV, was the King of Spain in name only, a man more interested in hunting than governing, easily manipulated, and famously indecisive, the kind of ruler who preferred silence to conflict and left most decisions to others. His mother? The opposite. Maria Luisa of Parma was commanding, proud, and scandalously open about her affair with Manuel de Godoy, a man who wasn't just her lover, but the real power behind the throne. Imagine growing up in a palace where everyone knew your mother slept with someone else, and your father just looked the other way. And you? You're just the prince, caught in the middle of royal humiliation played out in public. Ferdinand grew up surrounded by whispers about his parents, about the court's corruption, and about him, because by his teenage years, his physical deformity had become a running joke among servants, courtiers, even foreign diplomats. He wasn't the handsome young prince people expected. He wasn't the charming son of a glorious dynasty. He was an embarrassment, his condition exaggerated in rumors, but rooted in truth. Imagine knowing the people who bow to you during the day, laugh about your body behind closed doors, that every smirk might be a joke at your expense, that your most private insecurity had become public entertainment. That kind of shame doesn't just hurt, it reshapes you. Ferdinand didn't grow strong from suffering. He grew resentful, suspicious, cruel. And that cruelty didn't begin on the battlefield or in government. It began in the palace halls, with the people who couldn't fight back. Servants who accidentally entered his chambers at the wrong moment. A page who glimpsed him changing clothes. Another who didn't lower his eyes quickly enough. These weren't innocent misunderstandings in Ferdinand's mind. They were violations. Proof that people were mocking him, even when they weren't. He had them punished, flogged, exiled, sometimes simply disappeared. His power was limited at that age, but his fury wasn't. This was a boy who learned early that he could control others, even when he couldn't control his own body. That pain could be weaponized, that fear could silence laughter. And so, he began to lean into cruelty, not because it made him feel powerful, but because it was the only thing that made him feel less powerless. His tutors noticed the change. The once quiet child became sharp-tongued, vindictive, obsessed with rules and hierarchy. Every slight, real or imagined, became grounds for punishment. Every whisper fed the fire of paranoia growing inside him. Now ask yourself, what kind of ruler does that boy become when you give him a throne? What happens when shame, unchecked, evolves into tyranny? Because the wounds Ferdinand carried from childhood didn't heal when he became king. They festered. They infected his relationships, his politics, and ultimately, his entire kingdom. This wasn't just a dysfunctional family. It was a pressure cooker of humiliation, fear, and inherited arrogance, breeding a prince who didn't know how to love, only how to punish. And when that prince finally wore the crown, Spain would pay the price. He was mocked for what he was born with, and the world would suffer for what he became. For centuries, royal weddings were meant to symbolize hope, the union of nations, the promise of heirs, the beginning of a legacy. But in the case of Ferdinand VII and Maria Antonia, it was something else entirely. It was the beginning of a horror story. Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily was just a teenager when she arrived in Spain to marry the future king. She was bright, educated, and full of optimism. Raised to believe she would marry a noble prince, a man who would love her, protect her, and carry the hopes of two kingdoms on his shoulders. She couldn't have known what awaited her. That wedding night is one of the most disturbing moments in royal history. When Ferdinand entered the chamber and disrobed, Maria Antonia reportedly screamed. Not just screamed, but collapsed in hysteria. According to the accounts of her ladies-in-waiting, she backed into the wall shouting, "Monster! Monster!" Because what she saw wasn't just unexpected, it was terrifying. Ferdinand's anatomy, already infamous in palace whispers, was unlike anything the sheltered young princess had imagined. Long, misshapen, grotesquely disproportionate. It wasn't just large. It was inhuman. What followed wasn't a romantic night between two newlyweds. It was a medically supervised event. Custom-designed pillows, surgical oils, laudanum, an opium-based sedative administered to Maria just to get her through it. The consummation of their marriage resembled a procedure more than anything intimate. This wasn't a one-time horror. It became a pattern. Every attempt at intimacy required preparation, sedation, and silence. Maria Antonia, still a teenager, began to disassociate from her own body. To cope, she took larger and larger doses of laudanum, at first to numb the pain, then to numb the fear. Eventually, to numb everything. She began miscarrying, twice. Both pregnancies ended in devastating loss. The court blamed her fragile constitution, but those close to her knew better. The psychological trauma, the medical invasiveness, the constant pressure to produce an heir under unthinkable conditions. It was too much. Maria spiraled into depression. She stopped smiling. She stopped speaking. By age 21, she was dead. The official cause? Fever. But rumors swirled. Some whispered that she had wasted away from grief and addiction. Others believed something darker. That Ferdinand, frustrated by her failures, had her poisoned. That he wanted to move on, to try again with someone else, someone more suitable. There was no investigation, just a funeral, a quiet burial, and a palace that moved on like it hadn't just destroyed a young woman. This was more than a failed royal marriage. This was the systematic breaking of a girl, emotionally, physically, spiritually. And it begs the question, what is the cost of silence in the face of suffering? How many people must be sacrificed to preserve a crown, a tradition, a lie? Maria Antonia's story rarely appears in textbooks, but it should, because she was more than a queen. She was a human being, and her pain was real. She married a prince. She met a monster, and no one saved her. If one royal wedding ends in tragedy, you might hope that the next would be different, kinder, gentler, wiser. But in the case of King Ferdinand VII, history didn't just repeat itself, it intensified. Isabel was just 19 when she was sent from Portugal to marry her cousin, Ferdinand. She was delicate, hopeful, a quiet, deeply religious girl raised on fairy tales of love and loyalty. She didn't know, couldn't know, that she was walking into a nightmare already scripted by her predecessor's fate. The court had changed little since the death of Ferdinand's first wife, Maria Antonia. But behind its velvet curtains, the obsession with producing an heir had only grown more desperate. So desperate, in fact, that what awaited Isabel on her wedding night was nothing short of a planned medical operation disguised as romance. Once again, the royal bedchamber was outfitted like a surgical suite. Special cushions had been crafted, tools sterilized, foreign doctors brought in from across Europe. And even more disturbingly, so were circus performers, said to be experts in human flexibility and anatomical irregularities. Yes, you heard that right. When medicine failed, the palace turned to spectacle. Ferdinand wasn't just searching for solutions. He was treating his sexual dysfunction like a scientific experiment. And Isabel, she was the test subject. The wedding night was a disaster. What should have been a private moment of vulnerability became a scene of violence and fear. Servants reported screams, not of passion, but of panic, echoing down the palace corridors. Furniture was broken. Blood stained the sheets. The queen was found trembling, incoherent, and unable to walk without assistance. Isabel had been physically injured and mentally shattered. The days that followed were worse. She withdrew from court life, speaking only when necessary. Her health declined rapidly. She lost weight. She flinched when spoken to. Her eyes darted constantly, as if expecting something terrifying to appear at any moment. Physicians called it hysteria. But today, we'd recognize the truth. Isabel was experiencing severe psychological trauma, and nobody helped her. Instead, the palace doubled down. More experts were called in. The bedroom became a theater of bizarre experimentation. German anatomists, French surgeons, even alchemists and mystics, all paraded through the royal chambers like participants in some grotesque performance. Ferdinand allowed these strangers to observe his attempts at intimacy. Some took notes, some sketched, some wrote clinical reports that would later circulate across Europe's medical schools. The queen's body was no longer hers. It was data, a tool, a failed experiment. By 1818, Isabel had become a ghost within her own skin. She stopped eating, slept only in fragments, suffered hallucinations. Her ladies-in-waiting described her as a soul fading from the world before our eyes. She died later that year. The official cause? Nervous exhaustion. But the truth was far more harrowing. She died of trauma, of pain inflicted under the weight of expectation, of being treated like a vessel, not a person. And here's what's hardest to accept. This was not an isolated tragedy. It was the system repeating itself. A court that refused to acknowledge the damage done. A king so consumed by shame and obsession that he believed everyone, even his wife, was just a means to an end. How many women must be destroyed to preserve a king's illusion of power? Ferdinand moved on, once again. But for Isabel, the pain never ended. She didn't just marry a monarch. She married into madness. By the time Ferdinand VII married for the third time, no one expected romance. The fairy tale had long since crumbled. His first wife, Maria Antonia, had died from trauma and despair. His second, Isabel, had screamed through her wedding night and faded into death just 2 years later. So in 1819, when Maria Josefa of Saxony stepped into the Spanish court, she wasn't arriving as a hopeful young bride. She arrived like a scientist entering a broken lab. She had done her research. Before setting foot in Madrid, she consulted with physicians, German and Spanish alike, who had whispered to her the truth behind closed doors. This marriage wouldn't be about passion. It wouldn't be about love. It would be about method, about survival. So she came prepared, with her own medical team, her own devices, her own strategy. And for a while, it worked. Or at least it didn't fail as fast. Unlike her predecessors, Maria Josefa treated the royal bedroom like a surgical theater. Every encounter was scheduled, supervised, recorded in detailed journals. She noted times, temperatures, techniques. She documented everything, from positioning to psychological state, like a physician chasing a cure. And maybe in a way, that's exactly what she was doing. She wasn't just trying to help Ferdinand produce an heir. She was trying to solve the riddle of a king trapped in a body that betrayed him, and a court that refused to face the truth. But method has its limits, and eventually, Ferdinand began to notice something he couldn't tolerate: distance. Maria wasn't afraid of him like the others, but neither was she affectionate. She saw him not as a man, but as a malfunction to be managed. That cut deeper than any scream ever had, and so, paranoia returned. Ferdinand became convinced that Maria wasn't just recording his failures, she was reporting them. He accused her of sending coded letters to Germany, betraying the secrets of his condition to foreign powers. To him, her data wasn't science. It was espionage. He ordered her correspondence intercepted, her staff questioned, her physician followed. Because for a man like Ferdinand, intimacy without worship was betrayal, and clinical honesty was treason. Still, in 1829, something impossible happened. Maria Josefa became pregnant. The Spanish court held its breath. The king wept in joy, and for a brief moment, hope returned. But that hope was fragile and doomed. 7 months into the pregnancy, complications arose. Modern historians believe it was placental abruption, something treatable today, but terrifying then. Instead of allowing his doctors to act, Ferdinand did what he always did. He invited mystics, priests, even alchemists. He delayed real care while chasing magical cures. When Maria Josefa went into premature labor, the court watched in horror. Ferdinand, desperate, delusional, insisted on being present, shouting orders to physicians he didn't understand. The baby, a daughter, lived only a few hours. Maria Josefa lingered 3 more weeks. Fever, infection, silence. And then, she too was gone. This time, Ferdinand didn't scream. He didn't rage. He just refused to bury them. For nearly a week, he kept the bodies in the palace, demanding they be revived. He ordered prayers, experimental treatments, anything to undo what reality had written. But there was no undoing it. This was the end of Maria Josefa's story, and perhaps the last flicker of humanity in Ferdinand's. When love fails,
we grieve. When science fails, we learn. But when both fail, history remembers.
By 1829, King Ferdinand VII was a hollowed-out man. 3 wives had died under his rule. 3 women consumed by trauma, grief, and the crushing weight of royal expectation. He was getting older. His body, warped by nature and years of failed attempts at intimacy, offered no hope. And yet, he still had no heir. And without an heir, there would be no legacy, no continuation of the Bourbon bloodline, no guarantee that Spain wouldn't fall into chaos the moment he died. So, when his advisors presented him with a potential solution, Maria Cristina of Naples, young, healthy, and already pregnant by another man, Ferdinand said yes. It didn't matter that the child wasn't his. It didn't matter that the timing was blatantly impossible. What mattered was optics. If Ferdinand claimed the baby, if he recognized it as legitimate, it could silence doubters. It could stabilize the throne. It could write a new narrative, that the king had finally triumphed over his curse. So the marriage went forward. Maria Cristina walked down the aisle visibly pregnant, and the court pretended not to notice. It was a lie, an open one. But in monarchies, perception is often more powerful than truth. When the baby, Isabella II, was born, the palace erupted in celebration. Spain finally had a princess, a future, a line of succession. Ferdinand officially recognized her as his daughter. But in private, the shadows returned, because deep down, he knew. He knew the timelines didn't add up. He knew she wasn't his. And the very lie that gave him peace now became the seed of deeper paranoia. Ferdinand began watching Maria Cristina, not with affection, but with suspicion. He had spy holes drilled between their chambers. He would spend hours staring through them, watching her eat, pray, sit, even nurse the baby. He had her food tested, every meal, every dish, with a 30-minute wait between tasting and serving, to catch any slow-acting poisons. He wasn't afraid she would kill him. He was afraid she would replace him. Even her simplest actions, reading a book, speaking with a courtier, requesting new furniture, were seen as signs of treason. He interpreted prayer as coded communication, compliments as secret rebellion, silence as conspiracy. Maria Cristina, now queen consort of a decaying king, began to live like a prisoner in her own palace. Her letters were intercepted, her rooms were searched, her every movement was logged, and through it all, she had to smile, to curtsy, to play the role of faithful wife, while knowing her husband believed she was his undoing. Even the baby wasn't spared. Ferdinand would stare at Isabella for hours, studying her features, desperately searching for signs that she might somehow resemble him. Sometimes he convinced himself she did. Other times, he would call for painters, demanding new portraits, comparing them against his own, as if truth lived in brushstrokes. The heir he had longed for now haunted him. The lie that saved his throne became the truth that destroyed his peace. This was Ferdinand's final act, a king who accepted fiction to preserve a crown, then spent his last years tearing at it in fear. Because when power is built on illusion, the only thing more terrifying than the truth is losing control of the story. By the early 1830s, King Ferdinand VII was still alive, but barely. His body had grown weak, his mind even weaker. And yet, one obsession remained: fathering a true heir. Even after acknowledging Isabella II, a child he knew wasn't biologically his, Ferdinand couldn't let go of the fantasy. That maybe, somehow, he could still defy age, deformity, and reality. So he kept trying. Despite chronic illness, despite physical pain, despite a body that had long since failed him, Ferdinand insisted on intimacy with Maria Cristina. still clinging to the hope that she might give him a child of his own blood. But these attempts were anything but romantic. They were calculated, clinical, and deeply disturbing. Ferdinand began demanding that royal physicians inspect Maria Christina's skin before any contact, convinced she might be poisoning him through touch. Yes, touch. He feared her body itself had been weaponized. So each night, before approaching his queen, her skin had to be examined for powders, oils, or unknown toxins. This wasn't love. It was surveillance disguised as seduction. Meanwhile, his paranoia reached new depths. He became obsessed, not with fatherhood, but with paternity. Who was Isabella's real father? Ferdinand couldn't shake the thought. So he hired investigators, spies, and court informants, tasking them with an impossible mission: track down every man Maria Christina had ever met during her time in Naples. Every noble, every servant, every passing diplomat. No one was above suspicion. He ordered dossiers to be compiled, medical records examined, even had their faces compared to baby Isabella's portraits, looking for signs of resemblance in cheekbones, jawlines, eye color. He didn't just question his wife, he questioned reality itself. By 1833, Ferdinand wasn't ruling anymore. Not really. He was wandering, both physically and mentally. He roamed the palace corridors like a ghost, speaking to portraits of his dead wives, sometimes mistaking them for the living. He issued contradictory orders, forgot what day it was, and accused ministers of conspiracies no one could follow. Some days, he would eat nothing. Other days, he'd demand every dish be sampled 3 times by different servants, watching their faces for signs of distress. His own court feared him, but more than that, they pitied him. Because Ferdinand VII, the once feared monarch, had become a man entirely consumed by his body's failures and his mind's delusions. The grand palace, once filled with diplomats and music, had turned into a labyrinth of suspicion, echoing with whispered prayers and the sound of boots from guards who were never sure whether they were protecting the king or protecting others from him. When Ferdinand finally died in late 1833, the official cause was listed as gout. But his physicians, in private, told a different story. He died of exhaustion, not just physical, but psychological. A man broken by decades of shame, fear, and failure. In his final days, he drifted in and out of lucidity, sometimes calling for his wife, sometimes for his mother, sometimes for a child who might never have been his. And so the reign of Ferdinand VII ended not with glory, but with shadows. He left behind no true heir, no lasting peace, and no legacy untouched by scandal. Just a haunted palace, a traumatized queen, and a daughter whose throne was built on a lie he could never accept. He ruled a kingdom, but in the end, he couldn't even rule his own mind. Absolute power doesn't just corrupt, it consumes. Now that the life of Ferdinand VII has ended, what are we left with? A crumbling crown? A broken kingdom? No. What remains is something far more intimate, far more disturbing. After his death in 1833, Ferdinand's royal physicians performed a secret autopsy, not for the public, not for science, but for the church. The findings? They confirmed every whisper, every rumor. His genitalia measured over 14 inches, grotesquely malformed, curved, and wildly disproportionate, just as court physicians had claimed for decades. But there was something even more heartbreaking, even more human. Scarring, layers of it. Signs of self-inflicted surgery, desperate, clumsy attempts made over the years to fix what nature had given him. Ferdinand had tried again and again in secret to reshape himself, to be normal, to be a husband, to be a man worthy of love. But every cut only deepened the wound, physically, emotionally, politically. These medical records were never released to the public. They were sealed inside the Vatican, deemed too dangerous, too grotesque, too revealing. What they preserved wasn't just flesh, it was the embodiment of a monarchy gone mad. Because Ferdinand's story isn't just about deformity, it's about how personal shame, when combined with absolute power, can poison everything it touches. He didn't just suffer, he made others suffer for it. 3 queens, each of them young, full of hope, died under his rule. One was driven to addiction, one to madness, one to silence. His daughter, Isabella II, the supposed miracle heir, grew up in a palace of suspicion and lies, never truly certain of who her father was, or whether she was the product of a royal dream or a royal delusion. And Spain was shattered. While Ferdinand obsessed over potions and pillows, secret tunnels and sedatives, his country burned. Colonies revolted. The economy collapsed. The crown, once a symbol of power, became a global punchline. Ferdinand's reign left Spain humiliated, its people angry, disillusioned, and desperate for change. And yet, behind all the cruelty, there is a tragedy we cannot ignore. This was a man who, from childhood, was mocked, who never knew affection without fear, who saw mirrors as enemies and love as danger, who wielded power like a sword, but never found peace. So what's the lesson? What can we take from the story of one of the most twisted monarchs in European history? Maybe it's this: that unchecked power, when fused with unaddressed trauma, doesn't just fail, it destroys. That the lies we tell to protect reputations can become national nightmares. That when leaders put personal shame above public duty, entire empires collapse in their shadow. Ferdinand VII didn't just leave behind a body. He left a warning. He ruled through fear. He died in isolation. And Spain paid the price. If this story resonated with you, if it challenged you, disturbed you, or made you think, please consider subscribing for more raw, hidden truths from history's forgotten corners. And ask yourself, how many empires have fallen? Not because of war or politics, but because of one broken soul at the top.